Hi, this is Bill Hartzer, and this is SEO in 2025.
Bill, what's your number one SEO tip for 2025?
I think my best number one tip in 2025 is to concentrate on content and producing the best helpful content for users. But at the same time, you can use AI to find that best content and most helpful content to help you create. So you don't have to be just making up things as you go along. You can use AI to find helpful content.
Okay, great. And is this tip, do you think, relevant for any type of business, or is there a particular segment, a particular type of business that you're referring to here?
I would say any type of business. I mean, so for example, let's go, small business, even a home inspector that is hired right before you buy a house. A small business, it could be a one home inspector that produces content on his site that essentially is helpful to people and shows that he knows what he's doing, and that you should eventually hire him. So if you have, the helpful content and the right content on the site, as an SEO, it's kind of a combination of starting with keyword research and then that leading you into writing the appropriate content.
And you talk about content on his site. Is his own website the best place to be publishing still, or is there not an argument for a local business like that to perhaps be focusing on Google Local or social media or somewhere else?
There is. I mean, starting, if we're talking about, let's say this small business, sure. I mean, my particular process for a small business like that would be to do the research and come up with the ideas and use AI to help you come up with the ideas. And then you're using once you're posting on your site, then you're going to social media and following up and it could be shorter versions. It could be a blog post on the main site or a page on the main site. And then you go to LinkedIn and have a version of that article. You'd have you followed up with social media posts and so forth. So for that, even with Google Business Profile, you're talking about if it's daily or weekly or monthly, kind of a theme. When I talk about a theme, I talk, referencing, okay, it's very hot. And how do you cool off your house in summer? Could be an example. That would translate to a longer article on the website, and then all the social media with photos and smaller, whatever's appropriate for each platform to kind of actually bring back the links and bring, on that particular theme and topic, and be linking back or referencing, that business and that topic.
So what AI tools specifically then do you recommend that SEOs should be using at the moment to assist them with their content production?
There's a lot. I mean, there is a lot out there. There's a couple that I use daily that actually just before we started speaking, I literally had some, was using ChatGPT in particular. There's a website that has the new site, and it needs a lot of, title tags, meta description tags, etc. So just having, just asking it to write a basic meta description tag for a page about this with this title tag, you can just over and over again write, good unique title tags for site. If it's an e-commerce business, for example, I mean, you need a lot of those. Unfortunately, this particular case, you cannot really automate it. You have to actually ask an AI and copy and paste. There are tools that integrate into certain CMS that will, write the meta description tags and so forth for thousands of products. But in this particular place, that would be a kind of a prime example. when I'm looking at, building a new site or building out a section of a website, you could start with an AI such as ChatGPT and literally ask it something like, I'm writing a section or writing a web page about this particular subject, and what are the typical topics and subtopics that I would expect to see if I'm on this particular website and about this topic. It would actually kind of suggest you pages that you would expect to see when you go to that website. The next step is, okay, I'm writing a page about tickets or about, concert tickets. And what would you expect to see on a page, the topics and subtopics and sections if I'm writing a web page about, cheap concert tickets. So you start broad and you ask an AI questions like ChatGPT, and you can actually dig in a little bit more, get more granular, and then get even more specific. So having something like ChatGPT to essentially help you from the high level site structure down to the very specifics about each page.
You've certainly alluded to having extensive conversations with ChatGPT, and I guess one key to trying to ensure that you get as accurate and appropriate an answer, using perhaps your meta description example there. How do you actually go about prompting ChatGPT to try and ensure that your answer is as accurate as possible?
That's a good question. You kind of have to try different prompts. There are some tools out there that, or a list out there that other SEOs that have created that are, where they've written really good prompts. You could literally, for a meta description tags, I was asking it something like, write a meta description tag for a web page about this subject and include the company name in the meta description tag. And so just as that, basic, you kind of look at how it comes back. Sometimes in like, for example, today when I did it, it came back with the code, and I told it, okay, I don't need actually the code. I just need the 2 or 3, the sentences of it. And so you're not really relying on the AI. You're actually using your thoughts and brain to actually say, okay, this is actually something good, in this particular format, or I don't like this meta description tag, and you tell it something else. There is actually work to do. You're not totally relying on the AI for everything, and part of it is trial and error and seeing what it comes back with.
How do you know that the answer that you get from AI is good? I mean, do you have to manually check everything? Do you assume if it looks good, then that's something you can just use in your website?
That's a good question. I mean, it's when it comes down to whether it's good or not, some of that just comes with experience and, knowing the difference between a good title tag versus a good meta description tag, etc. Some of that comes with just, knowing how to write a meta description tag. If you're going to, for example, and the formatting, if you're going to, have 100 pages, you obviously don't want the same formula. You want it to change up a little bit. So there may be some other prompts to actually, ask it to write something different. Now, what was helpful today with my example of, let's say, football tickets or baseball tickets, there were a particular team that I was writing titled meta description tags for their tickets. And in fact, the AI was helpful because the AI knew that this particular team plays at this particular stadium. And so the AI incorporated the team name and football tickets and the name of the stadium into the meta description tag, where just off the top of my head, I couldn't think of the stadium where they play. And so that's a kind of a benefit to making that particular meta description tag unique. Part of that, we're talking meta description tags, but it could be just a Also using part of that or part of that as some content on the page or a few sentences on the page, which can make a difference.
What content production tasks wouldn't you use AI for at the moment?
That's a good question. Let's see. I think how it comes down to, it comes down to that I'm still in a situation where I'm not 100% comfortable with just literally copying, an article, for example, that AI might write and just pasting it without actually reading and doing some editing manually. That may come from my background as a writer and technical writer, my college days as training as a technical writer, and and knowing that there's just part of that content that I just would not literally copy and paste. A meta description tag, something you're less of a, you're probably better off using. But when it comes to a little bit more long form content, you need more structure and strategy and planning to work in entities and to work in the proper topics and subtopics, etc. And of course, all the content that I'm doing for clients, it's kind of a combination of AI content, and with my own editing as well as manually putting in photos and videos and into that content as well. So it's not just a one page of text.
You touched upon entities there as well, and you also mentioned earlier on the fact that ChatGPT was able to actually come up with a stadium name as well. So obviously it has some understanding and some awareness of where to find relevant entities. I mean, what are your thoughts in general about using ChatGPT to do that? And is it likely to miss out on a lot of relevant opportunities?
Yeah, so I touched a little bit about, okay, if I'm writing about this particular subject, let's say, home inspection or home inspector, the entities that I would expect to see in that content would be real estate, home, house inspection. It could be air conditioning, heating, various things that home inspector would look at. And so, those will all be entities. And we think about entities as being essentially a person, place, or thing that would be essentially it could be thought of as a wiki, anything that is in Wikipedia. So there is my understanding is there is actually, Google does have an entity API that can be run and so forth. I am using from time to time Index to identify the entities that are appearing in the top 10 results for a particular keyword. And so if I'm starting fresh with content, I would do a search for keyword and take the top 10 results or the top 20 results and see what entities are those and how many Google approved entities are they showing in that content. And so then at that point, I would want to make sure that at least, if there are, most of the top 10 results are showing, 8 to 10 entities, and then I would need to mention at least those entities in my content to be able to, be helpful enough to just rank in the search results.
And you'd incorporate those entities within the prompt that you'd provide ChatGPT with?
Yes. And I can pair, different prompts that I've asked ChatGPT to tell me what entities or what topics and subjects I should cover. It's kind of a manual process to, combine, both of those, and maybe even come up with another prompt if you're willing enough and taking enough risk that you're having the AI write the content versus personally write the content. Then you would ask ChatGPT to write the content based on this particular list of entities.
If an SEO is struggling for time, what should they stop doing right now so they can spend more time doing what you suggest in 2025?
What I'll suggest basically is doing some ranking analysis and traffic analysis, and analytics, and concentrate on the pages that you know that are bringing in traffic and bringing in sales and leads. Look at those particular pages, do some entity analysis to see if there's any topics or subtopics, or I would call them third level topics, subtopics that you haven't mentioned, that maybe some other pages that are ranking well, maybe they're mentioning this subtopic. Maybe they're mentioning, finance or more, mortgage when you're getting a home inspection, and real estate and homes, and you haven't mentioned a mortgage. So maybe you find in that content that you need to beef up that content a little bit. If you are limited on time, then you would look at the content or that is performing better right now and seeing how you can make that content better. And essentially, even if you're ranking first for that content, there's still a way to potentially expand that content. If you're ranking number one, the ideal situation, you can still expand that content out, and maybe you would bring in even more traffic.
Bill Hartzer is CEO at Hartzer Consulting. You can find him over at hartzer.com. Bill, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2025.
Thanks.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2025, the book, over at SEOin2025.com.